So I'm Daryll Brice. I teach in the sociology department here. Hopefully I'll see some of y'all in my class at some point. I've been here 16 years, if you can believe that. Some of y'all might not be 16. I might have been teaching here longer than some of y'all been alive. That's crazy to think about, right? I used to be the young professor. Now people think of me as like their dad. And soon I'm gonna be like granddad, so it's all good. Hopefully I'll be around that long. All right, so let's get started. So let's start with who's in the room. If you feel comfortable introducing yourself. I told you a little bit about who I am. I always like to get a sense of who's in the room. Anybody willing to introduce themselves? We talked about who's in the room. Who might you want to be in the room with us? Right? Honor some of your your ancestors, either dead or alive. That's pretty important. Who would y'all like to be in this space with us today? Let's welcome all of those people into the space with us. Yeah. Y'all feel better? Yeah, always remember to bring your people with you, right? Your people are important. All right, so why this, is important, right? This was actually posted on the bathroom at Texas State University, right? Somebody left this up. Now that our man Trump is elected and Republicans own both the Senate and the House, time to organize, tar and feather vigilante squads, and go arrest and torture those deviant university leaders spouting off all this diversity garbage. So all of this stuff we're about to, talk about today, this is how those folks, feel about that, whoever posted this. All right, so given the way that the atmosphere in this country is, going right now, this work is paramount, right, and important to, sort of understand and bring with us in everything that we do. So let me start with C. Wright Mills. He's a sociologist. And his theory was called the sociological imagination. And for C. Wright Mills, it was important to not just focus on the individual, but to look at larger social structures and how they might impact, the individual. A lot of times in the United States, we look at things from an individual perspective. Oh, I did this because I wanted to do this. Like one of my favorite, questions to ask students is, why are you dressed the way you're dressed? All right, why do y'all wear what y'all wore today? The next question is always, then why are y'all all pretty much dressed alike? If you chose it because it's comfortable, think about all of the things you could wear in the global context. All of the different kind of clothing, that people wear throughout the world. Are there clothes that are more comfortable than what you have on? Yeah, right?
Sweats and t-shirts.
Yes. But society sort of dictates what's acceptable and what's not acceptable to wear, right? So it's important to look at the social, not just, what the individual wants. So the second part of C. Wright Mills' theory, the one that I like the most, is he says it's the intersection between history and biography, right? If biography is your personal story, what's history? So what he's saying is that all of our individual stories are rooted in a much larger historical context, right? So I just didn't pop out and was like, I want to get a PhD and become a college professor. Right, my ancestors came here as enslaved Africans. That's part of that larger historical context that shapes my story. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
All right, so all of our stories are rooted in a much larger historical context. This is very important, to diversity. So I always mention this woman, Diane Nash. Any of y'all heard of the Civil Rights Movement?
Yeah.
Right, so Dr. King, Rosa Parks, right? Yes. Harriet Tubman was part of the Black freedom struggle. She was before, but yeah, absolutely. Absolutely part of that, legacy. Diane Nash was, and I like to mention her to students because she led the student part of the Civil Rights Movement. It was called the SNCC, or SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And one of the jobs that the students had was they wanted to desegregate the buses, right? The buses wouldn't allow, blacks to sit in the front, right? Had to always go to the back. So one of the things that the students wanted to do was they wanted to intentionally go on these buses and sit wherever they wanted, right? To show them that this system was unjust, that this wasn't right. She said one of the hardest things to do was collect letters. She actually came to Highline and spoke, and I'll never forget it, because she, looked at the crowd and spoke from her heart. You always feel it when people are speaking from their heart. And she said, my job was to collect these letters from, students that were going to desegregate, the buses. They called them the Freedom Rides. She said they would get a letter saying, can you make sure that my mother get this? Can you make sure that my father get this? Can you make sure that my girlfriend gets this? My brother? Because they knew they weren't all coming back. They knew that some of them were going to have to give their lives in order to make, life better for, everybody. And so she said, they all didn't make it back. All right? But she looked out at the crowd at Highline. She said, we loved y'all so much before you were even here that we were willing to die to make sure that y'all had a better life than we did. All right? To me, that's the epitome of the intersection between history and biography. Right? Because of the sacrifices that they made is why this classroom looks like it does in terms of diversity. Right? Because of the sacrifices they made. Society was really segregated. Blacks here, whites here, Asians here. Right? But they weren't going to stand for that. And she was willing to give her life. That's the sociological imagination in action. Right? All of our stories are built on the backs of those folks that came before us and changed society for what it is today. Make sense? Yeah, fairly simple. Fairly simple. Anybody ever read this book?
Oh boy.
Oh yeah.
Little things, yeah.
So I love this book because I had a teacher in college and he said he was a lawyer. He always carried this book with him whenever he went to court because he said he wanted the judge to know that there's always another side of the story. All right? Everybody knows the story of the three little pigs. That's what we call the master narrative in sociology. That's the story that gets told over and over and over and over again to people internalize it and just have it locked in and they know it. Very few people have heard the story of the three little pigs from the wolf's perspective. All right? This is what we call a counter narrative. And a lot of diversity and equity work is a counter narrative because you're getting bombarded from media, right, with how you should be, how you should act, right? What's acceptable, what you should and shouldn't challenge. Diversity flies in the face of that. It says we all have a place, right? Diversity and equity says we all have a place and should be treated, equitably. So with that, let's do some vocab. Diversity in and of itself just means difference, right? So this is where a lot of companies went wrong when they started doing, diversity recruitment. Because that just means you got a bunch of, numbers of different kinds of people working there. If that environment is not good for those people, who cares? All right? That just means you got a varied number of people there. Social justice, you might hear that used. That's, trying to ensure people get equitable distribution of the resources. People have what they need and want in life. Equity, not to be confused with equality, right? Equity means that people get what they need, right? Everybody has what they need. Equality means you treat everybody the same. Always like to use the emergency room example. Any of y'all been in the emergency room? You ever had to go to the hospital for something? Stitches, broken leg,
Seizures.
about 20 times, seizures.
Brain surgeries.
Brain surgeries, yeah. Yep. So think about this. Think about, the hospital or the emergency room this way. Equality would mean that no matter what you had wrong with you, the doctor would come out and say, everybody's getting Tylenol today. You treat everybody the same, no matter what's wrong with them, right? Your leg falling off, you get Tylenol, right? That's equality. You treat everybody the same. Equity, on the other hand, is when you diagnose people for specifically what might be wrong with them and try to correct that. You see the difference? Right? Rather than just treating everybody the same, right? People get what they actually, need. So when we talk about power, power is the ability to get people to do what you want, even if they don't want to. Right? And usually it's embedded in institutional structures, which, allow these kind of things to, happen to take place. All right? This is a Weberian notion. Max Weber was a, sociologist. He said power is the ability to get people to do what you want, even when they don't, want to. Right? And there's a problem with the way that we conceive of power, especially in the West, right? Because we usually think about as power over, rather than power, with or between. So privilege, right? Think about privilege as these unearned benefits that people just get for belonging to certain categories, right? You might hear white privilege, you might hear male privilege, able-bodied privilege, right? People don't even, sort of think about it. I like to think about privilege as the upside of discrimination, right? You've heard about people getting discriminated against, right? Job discrimination, housing discrimination, right? So two types of privilege. One is called unearned entitlements, right? These are things of value all people should have, like being able to feel comfortable in their workplace or being able to shop, right, without being harassed comfortably. Some people get that all of the time. Some people not so much. Then you have what's called conferred dominance, right? This gives one group control over another, right? So I think about when I first got the Highline, people policed me a lot that shouldn't have been. They weren't campus police. right? So what are you doing in this area? Why are you here, right? You know this parking is for faculty and staff. I'm thinking to myself, I am faculty and staff, right? But you know, you get policed by folks that shouldn't even be policing you, right? Because they feel like they have this dominance over you, right? That they can get away with it. So one of the most useful frameworks that I use in most of my, classes, especially diversity class, is what's called the addressing model, right? And the addressing model lets you see how power sort of operates based off of your identity, categories, right? So the first one, the A, would be age, right? And so the people that have power in terms of age are people that we consider to be adults, right? They generally tell children and elders, what to do, right? So they have that, sort of dominance. Then you have the two Ds, developmental disability and disability acquired, later in life, right? So the people that have power are temporarily able-bodied people. You think about the way that buildings are constructed, right? People don't usually have, people that with disabilities in mind, right? This is sort of, that power over. R would be, religion. So, in this society, you think about, Christians as, having that sort of power, right? Whose holidays are always celebrated that you always get off. Right, Christmas, Easter, right? That's not necessarily true for, other religions. You can think about the E as ethnicity or, racial identity. So in this country, white is the default setting, and then, people of color, right? Given some of the examples that, we've heard about being followed around based off of how you dressed, right? Social economic status, right? Folks with, money and, middle class, folks that have enough. So I always like to show this video, right? Because we talk about the groups with power as the agents. We talk about the groups without power as, targets. And so I always ask students, when you watch this video, it's a short clip from Ocean's 12. So this is a short clip, and then I want y'all to tell me what you think the lasers symbolize after we watch it.
Right, with no equipment, no rope.
Well, of course, come on. Don't tell me you don't know how to do that.
How did you get by the laser field in the Great Hall?
Aha. The laser fields. Well.
So the crazy thing about that scene was that was not something he could practice. Like the laser field was generated randomly. So, he just had to be able to sort of, bend and move to whatever the, the lasers were doing. He didn't have a set, pattern. So I like to show that after we talk about targets and agents, because I like y'all to think about, groups with less power, in the United States. And what do you think those laser fields or those lasers, sort of meant? So let's do this activity, right? This is one of the most simplest yet profound activities that somebody, did with a group of professors here. And I never, forgot it, right? one of the things that happens is a lot of times we get locked into our limitations in terms of how we think about things, right? Because we get so conditioned to the rules of the institution and, you know, what the institution says you can and can't do, that it kills your creativity, right? So I want y'all to partner up. Y'all can do 3s or 2s with somebody close to you. And here's what I want you to do. How would you want your educational setting or your school, what would you want it to look like if there was no limitations, right? How do you want the classrooms to look? What kind of furniture would you want? What kind of teaching? Where would you want the classes to take place? You have no limits. No limits, right? You had chairs made of gold if you want, right? What would you want your learning environment to look like? No limits. No limits. What would your learning environment look like if you could set this up? Right? So find some groups. Yeah. So just a final thought. I know one of the questions Julie wanted me to cover was, you know, what ways do I see sort of diversity and equity work being done at, you know, Highline? And I think the Achieve program is an excellent example, you know, of it. I've had several Achieve, you know, students in my class that do extremely well. I think like programs like Emoja, the affinity group programs for, you know, African American students, anybody can join, but it's, you know, based on African American, you know, sort of principles and teachings, makes the, you know, curriculum more culturally relevant. And Appeasy for, you know, Asian Pacific Islanders, Puente for Latino folks, right? So, you know, I think those are, you know, great examples. And then we do the most extensive MLK week, you know, in the state of Washington, right? Highline has that distinction. We do a whole week of celebration. People usually only dedicate a day. And then we have Unity Through Diversity Week coming up in the spring, right? Which is a week of, you know, programming, kind of like, you know, MLK week. And then the clubs. I mean, Highline is, you know, different from a lot of schools. Yeah, in that way, you know. So my final thought, this is a, you know, a kid with a bunch of balloons. I'm gonna tell y'all a story, you know, for you know, sort of the concluding thought around this. All right. There was a kid whose dad took him to a carnival for the first time, right? And he got amazed by seeing these guys, you know, blowing up balloons. He was intrigued, right? He could not figure it out because these balloons were all different shapes. You know how some are long and skinny, some are, you know, round, some are animal shaped. And all these balloons, you know, were floating. So he was sitting there, you know, watching, right? They filled up a long one. The long one, you know, floated, you know, up in the air. They filled up a big round one. The big round one floated up in the air. They filled up one that was shaped like a dog. It flew up in the air. It was blue with purple dots on it, right? There was all these colors, all these different shapes, all these different sizes. And the little boy, you know, pulled on his dad. He was like, Dad, what is going on here? How is it possible that all these different kinds and shapes of balloons, you know, are floating? And his dad looked at him. He said, you know what? If you fill them up with the right stuff, anything will rise, right, to great heights. Right? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Right? If you fill people up with the right stuff, they all have the ability, you know, to rise to these, you know, great heights and accomplish great things. Right?